Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Lewis Pearson. I'm the program coordinator for the philosophy program here at the University of St. Francis. Also co-director of the Living Your Call program, a program intended to help undergraduates discern what God may be calling them to. If you aren't on our mailing lists, but you would like to get emails or newsletters about these public lectures, please be sure to sign in on the binder sheet that's there at the door. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with a prayer. It's mainly a reading from the book of Kings, 1 Kings. Feel free to prayerfully join your thoughts to this reading. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. For the Lord is about to pass by." And a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. After the wind, there was an earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. That may have been a bit irreverent for a prayer. If your eyes were closed, you missed the joke. If they were open. It's all about distraction. While I was reading, various things were popping up on that iPhone screen. And if you're familiar with this passage, you may realize I didn't mention the things that came after, right? God wasn't in the wind, wasn't in the earthquake, wasn't in the fire. Perhaps a more reverent prayer to actually start us off. God, please direct our thoughts to you at all times. Help us to hear you, to understand what we hear, and to obey. Amen. All right. So I'm going to have on the side of this screen, and since I don't have a screen here, I'm going to be looking over here at times, just an overview of the entire talk, and every once in a while when there's some text to help, it's going to show up on the other side. We're going to start by talking about part of the subtitle of this talk, Hearing God's Call in the Age of Distraction. Now, we didn't invent distraction. We didn't invent sin, although we'd like to take credit for it, maybe. I mean, we like to take credit for just about anything. But we've been a distractible species since the beginning, as far as I know. If you're familiar with the story of the great feast in Luke chapter 9, a rich man throws a feast, and the people he's invited say, "Oh, I just bought a field. I'm going to go check it out. Please tell him I'm excused." A field, right? "I just got married." I kind of understand. "I just bought 5 yoke of oxen, so please tell him I'm excused." And the rich man gets very upset and says, "Look, I'm throwing this party, whether these people come or not. So invite the poor, the lame, the hungry, everybody else. We don't need devices to distract ourselves, right?" So I don't want to, this isn't going to be a kind of screed against technology, but I do want to talk about technology and what about our age is perhaps unique. Even though distraction isn't unique to human experience, the ways that we're distracted, I think, have come to a head because of the, you might say, the immediacy that we experience the world in because of the way that technology can bring things to us. So 3 things I pointed out. There's other things you can talk about in our age, but 3 things that I think stamp this as a kind of age of distraction. An age of many things that are great, but distraction comes with it. Immediacy of communication, immediacy of recognition, and immediacy of gratification. What do I mean by that? I think you could probably fill in the blanks yourself to think about that. Immediacy of communication, I send an email and it's there within the speed of, however long it takes for the stuff to go down the wires, get to the other guy, pretty fast, few seconds. Used to be I'd write a letter and I'd wait, a few weeks to get something back. And in the waiting, as I got closer to the time when I thought, maybe the letter's coming today, I would be on pins and needles for maybe half an hour, and the postman would come by, and after he left, I'd forget about it. Same thing with phone calls. And phone calls are more immediate, but I wouldn't necessarily be on pins and needles unless I was expecting a call, or I know that office hours are over, and so I'm not worried anymore. Email's not the same thing, right? Or any version of social media where you can send messages and receive them. Where someone can send something at 2 in the morning and feel like he's not crazy to think to himself, "I just posted a picture of my family at Easter. How come no one's liked it yet?" right? I mean, if you realize you've seen this impatience in yourself, or you see, you know, I've given it a day and no one said anything, no one's commented on my post. We're spending a lot more mental energy, I think, on these kinds of things. This sort of expectation, I think, is part of many people's lives today. It wasn't part of our lives before, even though we were very proficient at communication. But because of the immediacy of communication, this expectation, I think, is a constant presence in our conscious thinking about what people are thinking about me right now. This actually has to do with, I think, the immediacy of recognition as well. Everyone has a phone that has a camera on it, or many people do. And for that reason, many people have GPSs on them. Many people have things that when they post it, because of the software we have, you can be recognized, and Facebook will identify you as the person in the picture, even if you don't put that caption up yourself. Not only are we on pins and needles waiting to hear back from people right away, but people know who we are right away. If you want to look someone's IP address up, I mean, this helps in forensic police work too, but we can find out where you were and when you did it. This is good, this is bad, but again, it might feed into this wondering to yourself, well, who am I writing this for? What image am I portraying here? Oh, my mom's a Facebook friend too, not just my coworkers. And my coworkers are Facebook too, but my kids, right? And so we have all these audiences in mind. And when we edit, for the sake of giving a particular image, I imagine there's a lot of anxiety there. It's much different than talking with someone casually. Now you have to wonder, is someone taping this? Did someone take my picture? Is someone going to take what I've said out of context? And so this adds, I think, a level of, again, anxiety to what it is we think we're doing when we're being recognized in the very act of communication. The immediacy of gratification also, I think, is something that stamps our age. And one thing that I think is sacrificed because of what technology's achieved for us, the many great things, we don't have time for those, there are many. We'll just talk about some of the bad things. Rhythm, I think we're thrown off on. Used to be, if there was a television show that I enjoyed, right, this isn't make or break, I'm not going to a wedding, it's just a TV show I like to watch. I'd have to sit down and watch it at a certain time. And I knew that everyone else was watching with me. And if they kept the TV on the whole time, that everyone saw the same commercials as I did, they got the same interruption from the news breaking, all the same experiences I could assume because we all had to watch television at the same time. And I didn't have to worry about everything else in my life getting in the way because there was this rhythm. I mean, if something's getting in the way, there's a meeting and I can't watch my show, I have that worry. But it's a worry that's associated with rhythm. Well, all these shows are now being released on DVD and Blu-ray, so I can watch them anytime I want. I can even stream them on Netflix. I don't even have to get up off my couch and switch out the DVD. I don't even have to push next. Netflix is set up so that the next show will just play on its own. I can just sit there and binge watch, right? There are good things about this, but the main thing I want to point out is so many things have come to pass that allow us to be led as opposed to having us sit back and hear. I mean, sitting back and watching Netflix is a kind of passive experience, this hearing for something. I don't know if it's the best kind of passive experience. We'll come back to the age of distraction at the end. But these are just some of the marks of it. I wanted to save nothing for the end and try to get as much of this out as possible at the beginning. So how do we hear through this noise that's coming? And it's not just coming from our devices and our technology, but if you notice, it's coming from us and how we use it. You don't have to be stressed out about whether people have looked at and liked your Facebook post. You choose to be stressed about it. How do we start to listen to this? 8 things I wanted to point out here at the beginning. One is to hear through this noise, to hear God through this noise, it would help to realize that we're made for hearing God. It's where we get our meaning. It's how we're wired. If this is news to you and you need more convincing, I think number 2 says more to this point. When I say we're made for hearing God, think about all the ways we're already trying to listen. If not for God, for something, for someone, for some meaning. I mean, why is it we get so stressed out when someone has not yet liked or commented on some post that we've made? Email, phone calls, door knocks, texts. So much of our life is made up of waiting and then hearing and then responding. Sometimes the response is just a simple emotional response. Oh, finally, I got enough likes to feel okay about what I just posted here, and it wasn't something offensive or scandalous. But think about how much of your life is spent answering some kind of call. Colleagues, in my case, students, all kinds of calls all over the place. Imagine what your life would look like without them. It seems almost all, if not all, of our meaning comes from waiting, listening, and responding. People who know this take advantage. Clickbait. If you haven't heard this term, those who missed it while we were praying, here's some clickbait examples. 1 Kings, we have Elijah being told something by God. But that's not how we see things when we log into MSN.com or Yahoo or Outlook or whatever. We see this stuff at the end, right? Amazing thing that happens next will blow you away. Mountain where Moses saw a burning bush has another visitor you won't believe. Uplifting quotes for the rockiest day. 5 millennial-inspired tips for navigating natural disasters. Find out why bad things always seem to happen in threes. Right? Right? And God's over here. Right? He's not over there. I think you've seen these things, right? And I mention them because they're so effective. It was actually, you might try this for yourself. C.S. Lewis, when he wrote the Screwtape Letters, they're a fictional account of an elder demon teaching a younger demon how to tempt souls. Lewis said it was one of the hardest books for him to write because he had to sort of twist himself backward and think about goodness in reverse order. The benefit to the reader is we're convicted when we find out we're succumbing to these temptations. But for Lewis to have achieved this reverse kind of conviction as a reading experience, he had to sort of take on the demon's perspective. Not that this is necessarily demonic, but trying to come up with clickbait that matched these passages from 1 Kings, I think was a revelatory experience for me. I know that I've gotten better and better after I log out or log in and I see all of these, breaking news, world reports, sports news, entertainment news, and all these things, and they're trying to get me to click on them by the provocative title. Although I've gotten better and better, I still find myself clicking on at least a couple a day. 15 signs such and such is happening in your life. Having to write these, I got a little sick of them. I thought, this is how you write them, and this is what's going on. But this is something like cotton candy, right? We all have a taste for sweetness, and we all realize cotton candy is nice, but cotton candy all the time, not a good thing. Clickbait's something like cotton candy for the mind. When we realize we get our meaning in hearing and responding, we can become more self-aware of what we do when we spend all these little pieces of our day looking at clickbait articles, right? Even if it's just 15 minutes a day, that's 15 minutes I more or less wasted. I wasn't edified. I didn't learn much. Maybe I have something to say that's interesting to my wife for about 2 minutes. I think I could have talked about something that was much more worthwhile than that. But when we start to realize what we're doing, when we look at things like clickbait, it can help us to start identifying patterns, right? You can start to figure out, why is it I continue to click on these lifestyle tips, or these top 10 clickbaits, or the ones about crime, or the ones about taxes, or the ones about celebrities, or the ones about sports. You may already know you have these interests. You may have a good place for them in your life. They're not bad. But when you start to see what they do to your way of thinking, when you can be so easily diverted from a task so that you don't even remember why you got on the computer or your phone, right? This kind of self-awareness leads to this next step of pattern recognition. What is it about my clicking on these telling me about who I am and what's interesting for me? And is this a good or a bad thing? It could be both. When we start to recognize these patterns, we can then start to recognize the persons behind the patterns, you might say. The first layer is us. And a little irony, I went on Redeemer Radio earlier this week to help advertise this lecture, and I wear a suit and tie, as I typically do, to go on the radio, right? And I wore this today. This will become Yeah. The lecture finale is on my shirt, so I'll explain that later on. But this first level of pattern recognition has to do with us and what's wrong with us. Why is it we can't see through what we're doing to ourselves and how we're distracting ourselves? Once we can start to recognize these patterns, we can then start to hear other people. I can't hear you when I'm distracted by my constant desire for cheesecake. Or I keep wanting to click on articles about my favorite singer, right? There's some email from a student. I don't know. There's something happening with Taylor Swift. Let me click on this, right? I can't hear people talking to me that matter until I recognize these other patterns that are distracting me. After I do this, I might actually start hearing God and neighbor, right? And when I do that, I can start to make sense of other patterns. And I mentioned here in parentheses, think about the difference between when you think you're hearing random noises and when you're expecting someone at your house. How you interpret what you hear is very different. And in the case where you're expecting someone, your interpretation is usually more accurate. You knew what was happening when you heard those things. Without that knowledge, it's the exact same stimulus, but your understanding of what you're hearing is different. So how to hear through the noise partly involves how to interpret what we hear, not as noise, but as something else, as a call. If we know that there's a God who's talking to us, it can help us to know that he's talking to us everywhere and in all places. Right? For all the good that our technology can do, aside from that in itself, God speaks to us everywhere. Some of us have mountaintop experiences like Elijah, like Moses, where there's something like a voice, where I know exactly what God is telling me. The Holy Spirit's laying something on my heart. God speaks to us that way. He speaks to us in other ways as well. So think about sin, right? God doesn't just speak to us through, he does this. He speaks to me through my wife, through my kids. What am I supposed to do today? When my wife tells me something, when my kids tell me something, when my students tell me something, that's God talking to me. Hey, do this. You're supposed to teach this class. This is what you said you're doing today. These are my students' voices, my family's voices, but they are also God speaking through them. God can do that. But he can also speak to me in, you might say, indirect ways. When I distract myself, when I could have finished grading, and so I had more time for my family. Instead, I got distracted by a YouTube video, and I've got to take some work home with me, right? And this becomes habitual. And I start to realize there's a bit of disorder in my life at home. I feel scattered. I don't feel like I can rest. This is a way that God speaks to us. Natural consequences of self-destructive behavior. In our sin, when we reach a point of despair and we realize I can't do this anymore, and we can't help ourselves and we continue to do it anyway. The way St. Paul says, I do what I don't want to do, and I can't do what I know I'm supposed to do. This is God speaking to us through these consequences. How, when we're in the grips of these bad habits, these vices, these patterns of distraction, that in some cases we're not even aware of, how do we start to, you might say, straighten ourselves if we're twisted, right? Because we have these lenses, these vices that filter the world. I can't see and hear you for who you are because I'm so preoccupied with satisfying certain desires that I have to find out about my favorite entertainers or find out about the 50 best things about Indiana or whatever, right? If I'm already too bent over my own preoccupations to hear and see you, but I know there's a you out there, and there's a God beyond all of us. How do I start to straighten myself? Well, I look for role models. Right? There's biblical examples, there's saints, there's personal heroes. I think all of us have this experience of being neophytes in some area when you started a sport, when you started a job, and you come in because you like the thing, you think you're good at it, you want to do it, and you start to get discouraged at the beginning because boss says or coach says, don't do it that way. Or you get yelled at for, some particular thing you do, and you feel slighted. You think, I know what I'm doing. This feels good. Don't tell me to swing the bat that way. It feels good to swing the bat this way. And yet we realize, given the person's experience and our failures, he's right, and we're wrong. I think most of us, especially here in this room, have had experiences like this, basically of being wrong. Right? Of going into a situation where you thought you were right, everything about you, not only your intellect, but your feelings about what you were doing, indicated you were on the correct path. And yet, something else made it clear to you, I am wrong about these at even the most fundamental emotional level. And so we realized I've got to trust coach, I've got to trust pastor, trust parents, or whatever the case might have been. Finding good models is very helpful, I think, when we start to realize those places where we're twisted, where we'd like to stand up straight so that we can hear God and neighbor. When we find these models, they help us to identify weaknesses and blindnesses. And so it's helpful not only to find a model who actually is standing upright and can hear God and neighbor, but to find a model that you can identify with. And I'll talk about some of these at this next point, number 3. And when we do this, outside the examples that we find for ourselves, the generic target at which all of us are aiming is virtue and holiness. Virtue is excellence, perfection, becoming what you're supposed to be, right? The virtues of a good computer versus a bad computer are that, it doesn't crash, it actually saves your documents instead of hiding them from you. The virtues of good microphones is they work, and so on. The vices are defects, they're imperfections, they're things that make the thing fail at being what it's supposed to be. And all of us realize the reason vice is something we want to avoid isn't just because we were told to, isn't just because we hear the word sinful, but we realize sin is self-destructive. It short-circuits our ability to flourish and be happy. And so the generic pictures of virtue, of what it looks like to be wise, courageous, just, moderate, faithful, generous, etc. If you were a Boy Scout, you could give me 10 more virtues right now. Trustworthy, loyal, obedient, courteous, kind, and so on. These models help us to see when I want to be that kind of person, I can actually be the kind of person who hears. Again, think in terms of the hearing metaphor. It's more than a metaphor, it's what we're actually doing. When you gain a musical ear, there are things you can hear that you couldn't hear beforehand. And so when you gain these virtues, you can see pain, and you can have that sympathy for neighbor that you couldn't see when you're just concerned about yourself. I want to mention, if you're interested in some of these topics, a lot of what I'm talking about comes out of the material I've been teaching here at St. Francis. 2 books in particular are relevant to this topic. One is Rebecca DeYoung's book, Glittering Vices. She's a professor at Calvin College up the road in Grand Rapids. And she talks about the vices. And I think the thing about her book that's most helpful is she helps us to see we often don't even know what the vices are, even though we think we do. And we often don't realize we have vices that we don't think we have. Her book isn't a matter of making us feel bad about ourselves, that we're worse than we think. But it's a matter of uncovering what it is that might be wrong so that we can actually identify and diagnose, get over them. Sloth, for instance, we think of as laziness. And so how do you fix laziness? Your old-fashioned Protestant work ethic. You go out and work. What she points out is in the tradition, we see that sloth is a matter of being lazy about love. Lazy about the thing you're supposed to be doing right now. Here's an example. When I had to write my doctoral dissertation, everything was more interesting to me than that. I remember I'd see our bathroom, and my wife complained about, it was two-toned, the toilet. The toilet seat had been replaced, and the toilet was tan, and it was this ugly thing. So I ripped the whole thing out. And I thought, while I'm at it, let's put up a new vanity, right? So I redid the whole bathroom. And I remember I shared some pictures with friends on email, and my first response was, write your dissertation, right? But everything's more interesting. I got to clean my room first, or, it could be good things. Nothing wrong with all these things that we do. We don't necessarily distract ourselves with vicious things. But sloth is about not attending to the thing that love is demanding of us now. In a relationship, there might be some sort of tension that needs to be addressed and engaged. But instead of talking to your significant other, you start to do charity work and say, I'm busy with these other things, right? And so clearly you're not the bad guy. You're doing good things, but you're actually being slothful because you're avoiding the thing that it's hardest for you to do. And sloth is about this kind of avoidance. But I highly recommend this book because chapter to chapter, DeYoung focuses on a different vice, and she shows us this is what this vice is about. It's not just this list of scandalous things that show up in movies, but they're down-to-earth things. And they're not necessarily the worst things that we do, but they're habitual things that cause us to self-destruct, right? Not writing my dissertation for a few days because I'm redoing my bathroom is not the worst thing, but it's indicative of something in me. Procrastination is this kind of sign. I don't like to do a thing when it's hard. Let me do something else. Aristotle helps us to get a picture of the virtues, if you want to read his book. what does it look like to be an excellent person? And he identifies virtues to perfect mind, which will show up in a few minutes when I talk about what's on my shirt, and virtues to perfect our appetites and our emotions and our will. So what are some models we could look at in terms of finding someone who can help me figure out, how am I being distracted? Why is it I only hear noise and I don't hear God and neighbor in the surrounding environment? Moses, if you can't read this, I just wanted to point out, remind for those of you who already know, how hesitant Moses was in his call from God. And I wanted to point a few things out. If you look for models, if you want to go to the Bible to look for a model, it always helps to look for the entire context. Context tells us a lot, right? One example I want to bring up just for the sake of illustration, the whole judge not lest ye be judged. I hear that a lot, especially as I teach ethics classes. We'll cover an ethical standard, and someone says, well, you can't tell me I'm right or wrong, judge not lest ye be judged. And so the natural question would be, why not? Where do you get that from? Well, it's in the Bible. Let's look it up. And of course, if you know the story, Jesus is saying, two guys have messed up, right? One guy has the lesser sin, and he tries to convict his fellow brother. And the lesson is, look, if you will have no mercy on your brother, don't expect mercy for yourself. You both failed. So unless you want the judge to spare any mercy for you, don't spare the mercy for your brother. So the point isn't that you're not wrong. The point is that you're both wrong. The point is there's a standard that both of you have failed. So what's this thing about judge not lest ye be judged again? Let's go through that again, and then the student will sort of back down. But context helps us to see, what does this thing mean in its fullness, right? So what is Moses doing? Well, he's fled Egypt, and if you watch how he flees and why, he seems to be concerned with justice. Right? He sees a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian, and we don't have the details from Exodus, not really clear how just he was in his fatal retribution, but he kills the Egyptian, and he flees, right? Next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting. He says, what are you guys doing fighting? And they say, who are you to talk to us? We just saw you kill an Egyptian. But over and over, if he's hot-headed, if he's doing it right or wrong, we see this concern for justice. Then he goes out into the desert. These women are being kept from a well. And he goes to their defense. He says, hey, let them get water. And he eventually marries one of these women. And what is he doing when God calls him in this burning bush episode from Exodus? He's tending Jethro's flocks. Jethro is his father-in-law. So we see the kind of man he is, right? There's something about the kind of person we see in these biblical characters before God speaks to them in this mountaintop experience. There's already something upright and virtuous about them that allows them to hear and stop and see and know what they're looking at when they see it. And when he sees, God speaks to him. And when he speaks to him, Moses' response is, no, not me, God. Right? Even though he has this concern for justice, even though he's upright enough to be able to hear and understand what he's hearing when it happens. I counted 7 times. 2 of these are actually, he's in the middle of his mission. The ones I like the most are objection number 4, when he says, if you please, Lord, I have never been eloquent. And God says, I've done all things. You don't think I can make you eloquent? And Moses says, but still, please not me. And God actually, in his mercy, says, fine, I'll give you Aaron. Take this dude along with you, right? So he doesn't force Moses to do things this way. He could have. I mean, he could have said, this is what you're being called to. It wouldn't be forcing. It'd be saying, say yes or no to this call. He gives him Aaron instead of making him eloquent, which was his first, from the dialogue, it looks like that was going to be the first thing he does, give Moses his words. But Moses says, please, please, no. Okay, I'll give you a spokesman. Look at Samuel, a young man who's been an attendant to the priest Eli, who keeps hearing God's voice, and he thinks it's the voice of his master Eli. This is interesting, right? As I mentioned, when we hear God's voice and those around us who need our help. In this case, it was God directly calling him, and he thought it was his priest. But in this case, we see a proper kind of reverence and understanding of his place as a servant enabled him to be able to hear. He just attributed it to the here and now, the man that I know, not the God that I've not yet heard from. Elijah, after he's been fleeing from Ahab and Jezebel, who are trying to kill him, for 40 days and 40 nights of walking, he arrives at Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had the burning bush experience. He says this to God after God says, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He says, "I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, but the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." It's interesting, in this case, we have a man who's looking for God, not the other way around. We have a man who's on the run. And what he says is, "I've kept the faith, but I'm all that's left." He's very, very tired. There's very little that's left with regard to what Elijah does next in the story that we have of him from Kings. He gets taken up in a fiery chariot later on, but almost immediately he goes to Elisha. So God gives him a threefold charge, and he only does one of them. He's supposed to go and anoint 2 kings, and then anoint his successor, Elisha. He goes straight for Elisha. He skips. Look at his request twice. "I'm tired. I'm all that's left. I'm tired. I'm all that's left." God must have not had too much of a problem. He took him up in a chariot. Maybe that's not as good as we think. Maybe there's a problem with the chariot. In any case, what happens with Elisha, the next man who comes along? Elijah comes along and puts his cloak over Elisha. And the first thing Elisha does is says, "Please let me go say goodbye to my mother and father." And Elijah's response is, "I've done nothing to you." He starts walking off. It's a very enigmatic exchange, very short, a lot of stuff to unpack, as is typical in the Bible. And after saying this to Elijah, Elisha goes, he breaks up the plow, he slaughters the oxen he's been using for his work, which seem to be indications that he's just saying goodbye to this life, and he moves on. I want to juxtapose Elisha's story because it looks like a story of obedience. He says, "Just let me say goodbye to my mom and dad," with a gospel story. To another, Jesus said, "Follow me," but he replied, "Lord, let me go first and bury my father." He said, "Let the dead bury the dead." Here's another one. "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to my family at home." To him, Jesus said, "No one who sets a hand to the plow and looks to what was left behind is fit for the kingdom of God." It's not clear that what Jesus is saying implies that Elisha was somehow initially disobedient. But there's an interesting tension happening there. And if we focus now, I wanted to have that first story for this, saying goodbye to my family, because Elisha says that before he starts to follow Elijah. Look at the dead bury their dead thing. If you do read the Gospels, you realize how sort of strange and enigmatic and kind of jerkish Jesus is. Right? A young woman asks for help, and he says, "This is for Israel, not for dogs." Right? A woman who's looking for help, and he basically compares it to her. Jesus is very strange in this way. What sense does it make to say to someone, "Let the dead bury their dead"? I wanted to just bring up for consideration the story of Matthew. It's the same kind of story. Someone says, "Let me bury my father." He says, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." Then he gets in a boat, and they cross a body of water. And on the crossing, there's a storm, and his disciples worry about perishing. Jesus scolds them for their lack of faith. He calms the storm. And on the other side, they're met by 2 demoniacs who have been barring the way to tombs. No one could even get to the tombs because of these 2 demon-possessed people. No one could even bury the dead if they wanted to. Something very strange happens when you see context. But the main thing I wanted to point out is familiarity is one of the things that makes things sound like noise. It could be that noise is something that doesn't distract us, but that we become so inured to, it means nothing to us. And so in that sense, it's noise. It's nothing that contributes to our meaningful experience of the world. We get used to these sayings, "Let the dead bury their dead." We don't know what they mean. I mean, we might think we know what they mean, but they don't have a lot of effect on how we live our lives. This is what happens when things become cliche. So you look at the context of when Moses is called. You look at the context of things that you think you understand, and weird things come out. I'm not going to spend more time exegeting this passage, but let the dead bury their dead, and they have this crossing with a storm, and there's a demoniac preventing people from getting to tombs. Something weird's happening here. Well, let's look at not a biblical model, but a model dear to those of us here at St. Francis. Francis himself, Francis of Assisi. So what's he doing when God calls him? One of the many times God calls him. One of the pivotal moments. He's in the ruins of the chapel at San Damiano praying. And what is the call? He hears God say, Francis, rebuild my church. What does Francis do? Brick by brick, he rebuilds the church that he's sitting in. Now, here's an interesting thing about Francis. In the lens of history, some of us think, oh, silly Francis, typical Francis. He does this thing when it looks like God was calling him to rebuild the Church Universal. I think Francis actually got the story right. So Pope Innocent III has this dream where the whole church is topsy-turvy, and there's one man holding it, and it's Francis. It's very likely, possible, and God does this all the time, that God intends that Francis's life in general helps to rebuild the universal church, and that he gives Pope Innocent this dream to help him see that Francis is doing this for God's kingdom. And yet, that God tells Francis, no, I want you to rebuild this church. If you look at the life of Francis, his life is always right here, this leper, this church. He is not a reformer. He is a man who sees need here. He doesn't see poverty, he sees this poor man. This, I think, is another example for us, I know for me in particular, as someone who teaches philosophy, who's attracted immediately to the universal, to first look at the particular, and to end in the particular. Francis's life from beginning to end is about the particular. He rebuilds the universal church one brick at a time. You've heard that saying maybe, think globally, act locally. That's not Francis. Francis is think locally, act locally. It's always here that he knows God's going to be present for him. I remember also when I first came here, and I asked Sister Carol Myers in chemistry, why are you called the Sisters of St. Francis of Perpetual Adoration? It's such a mouthful. I didn't know much about Francis at the time. I didn't actually have a personal love for Francis myself. Too ascetic for my taste. Too much that he sacrificed. I like clothes. I like good things. I see the bounty of God's creation. I want to say yes to it. I thought Francis was saying no to it, and I couldn't follow him. I could admire him, but not have a lot of personal affection for him. And so I only understood Francis the way that many people understand him, as the garden statue Francis, right? Why aren't you the Sisters of St. Francis of Creation, or I don't know, something like that? Well, as I started learning more about Francis, taking classes, reading books, being part of the culture and experience here, I came to understand why they're called the Sisters of St. Francis of Perpetual Adoration. Sister Carol basically said to me, well, I suppose that's what Maria Teresa Bonville named us because of Francis's great love of the Eucharist. And I thought, well, that doesn't tell me anything. I mean, that's what the name says, but I've never even heard of this love of the Eucharist. If you look at documents he's written, his last testament, his letters, his admonitions to his brother, the Eucharist is very important. It's like number one. In his testament, he says, I saw and smelled the leper, who I found repulsive, and then the Lord made him sweet to me, and I left this world. The very next thing he says is, the Eucharist is the one place we come face to face, the particular, with God on earth. And for this reason, even if I think a priest should have correction, I should feign to do so, and reverence priests above all others because the priests give us this Eucharist. It's all about the physical, the here, the now. Of course, I didn't know that. Once I came to understand it, Francis could become a model for me. As we look for our models, and we think we know what's wrong with us, and we think we know what models will help, hopefully this kind of path of self-revelation will make it clear whether we've picked our models wisely, or if there's models out there we didn't realize would benefit us greatly. And for me, Francis is one of those I didn't realize I could follow. So what about this shirt, our last 10 minutes here? I mentioned earlier, in this age of distraction, that the technology is great for all it can do. It can also distract us. So this main first problem we have is getting through the walls we put up. The navel-gazing, right? Philosophy as navel-gazing is a caricature it sometimes gets. Philosophy is not supposed to be about looking down and inward. It's supposed to be about looking up and outward. And so Plato gives this picture in the Republic. The character Socrates is having this conversation about justice. What's justice about? Is it just about whoever has the most power gets to say what laws are made? So democracies have democratic rules only because the people have the power, but it's only about power. Tyrannies have tyrannic laws because the tyrant has the power. Again, it's still just about power. Socrates engages this claim, and he says, I think it's wrong. I think there's something about justice that's beyond power. Whether or not you can make people do what you want and agree with you is different from whether or not what you're doing is good. Not just good for them and but also good for you. And so in the course of this discussion, they start to ask about the soul, right? Well, if we're talking about what's good for me and good for others, just stop talking about politics for a second and start talking about what happens inside me. And in book 9, it's 10 books. In book 9, Socrates, the character in this dialogue, says, imagine the soul like this. I'll read it here. Mold a single idea for a many-colored, many-headed beast that has a ring of heads of tame and savage beasts, and can change them and make them all of them grow from itself. Something like what I've got here in my shirt, these wolves, this snake, just a bunch of beasts, tame and savage. Now then mold another single idea for a lion. Got my lion here. And a single one for a human being. Let the first, the many-headed beast, be by far the greatest, and the second in size. Well, then join them. They are 3 in 1, so that in some way they grow naturally together with each other. We've got this big thing and this fire that represents the movement and activity of my soul. And now then, mold about them on the outside the image of one, that of the human being, so that to the man who's not able to see what's inside, but sees only the outer shell, it looks like one animal, a human being. So he says, imagine, put an image to your soul, make it look like this, and then put the human being on the outside so it's covered up. So when you reflect on yourself, you see the parts. But when people look at you, all they see is the outer shell, me standing here. And what he says about this ties together some of the things he's been talking about through the dialogue. And something like this is what goes on. He says, this many-headed beast represents your desires, and the human represents your intellect. Think about your day-to-day life. You've got all kinds of voices inside your head. I want to listen to this lecture. I want to get lunch. I want to go see a movie. I want to go take a nap. And we make decisions throughout the day. Sometimes we make good ones, sometimes we don't. Sometimes a voice gets a little too loud, even though we don't want to obey it. We just feel like we can't shut it up, and so we go and do what it says. But I think all of us have this experience of having like an entire body politic within ourselves. All these voices. And sometimes we say, well, this isn't really me. This is me. Or we realize they all are me, but I don't like this part, and I want to modify and train this and become a better me over here. And so he gives us this picture to think about what it's like to navigate the daily experience of having a divided will. When you get up in the morning, and the alarm goes off, and you hit snooze, right? Or the next day when you get up and the alarm goes off, and you just get right out of bed. Day 1, 2 things occurred to you. You thought to yourself, I need to get out of bed. I set my alarm and it went off. And another thought occurs. I'm not getting out of bed. Snooze. Right? At the same moment, you had 2 thoughts. You had a divided will right there when you became conscious. I want to get up at this moment. I don't want to get up at this moment. And of course, you had different reasons. You knew why you set your alarm. It feels good to stay in bed. Right? You knew why you set the alarm. It feels good to stay in bed. What's the difference between today when you hit the snooze button, when this part of you wins, and tomorrow when you just get up like that, and this part of you wins? And Socrates says, imagine something like a lion is there. It's like the army of your soul. And it goes to bat for whichever voice manages to win it to its side. So the day when your desires take you over and you say, I couldn't help myself, I succumbed to my baser instincts, something like that's happening. Or you say, I proved stronger than myself, I'm making progress. The lion properly obeys the intellect. And he gives us this picture to help figure out what goes wrong in our lives when they go wrong. When I'm caring mostly about what the lion cares about, winning things, victory, reputation, what people think about me, when I get stressed out because people are or aren't liking my posts, or I worry about what my image is saying to people, that's the lion that's taken over my soul. So that my day and my mental life is constructed around that concern and not actually about functioning excellently in life and doing what I'm called to do. When I'm concerned more with any kind of desire, lust, greed, control, you name it, this is the part of me that's taking over. So that I, again, don't see sympathy for fellow human beings in suffering, people whose need I can meet. I just see people who can give me or who can't give me what I want. And if this part of me takes over, it impresses the intellect into its service. And it says, you figure out how to wheel and deal and get us what we want to gratify ourselves. And do it in a way that doesn't bring attention to what we're doing so that we can keep getting what we want day to day. It turns out that this 2,400-year-old picture of the soul, I think, maps well onto some of the stamps of the modern age of distraction The immediacy of communication is a good thing, insofar as it can inform our intellects and help us to grasp what is real about the world and about the God who's created it, about the God whose nature is being revealed when we understand things about the world. But it becomes distracted when we succumb to what the medievals would have called curiositas. Curiosity we think of as a good thing today, but what they meant by it was, well, I click on a hyperlink here, oh, that looks interesting, let me do another thing. And 5 minutes later, I'm 7 hyperlinks in, I don't remember what I was looking for. I'm just being led by this desire to want to know something. It's like gossip. It doesn't edify, it doesn't connect to God and neighbor, but it feels like learning. And since we're wired for hearing and responding, we're wired for learning, clickbait works on us. Well, immediacy of communication can do this kind of thing to us. We go from communicating for the sake of connection with reality, with God and neighbor, to rabbit trails of gossip that are basically isolating us. You sit back and you realize, I just wasted half an hour. I don't know where I am, what time it is, if I've missed a meeting. It's a real isolation. The immediacy of recognition, this part of us that likes to win, that when properly ordered, knows how it should fit into a social order, right? What I'm supposed to be to my children, to my students, to my colleagues. And instead becomes this warped, what do people think of me? Do they like me? Have they liked my posts? And the immediacy of gratification. It is good that we can enjoy food. We know when we're hungry. We enjoy rest and so on. But when, like a Netflix that constantly feeds us a kind of cotton candy, we can't say no because we're getting this gratification faster than we can tame the beast. We have a distraction, and we have disorder in the soul. So when we find out from people like Plato and other models that there isn't necessarily a problem with the world, there's just there's a world that knows how to tap into our weak points. We can start to focus in on how to strengthen those weak points and become virtuous. I'd like to end with a reverent form of the prayer that I began so irreverently from 1 Kings, that when the Lord was going to pass by, first there was a wind that shattered the mountain, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, and that was God. And if you think about when you whisper, you may come to realize some of the most important things we have to say, we often reserve for the whisper. Thank you. Now, I want to thank you for coming. It's currently 1:49. If you have a 2 o'clock appointment or want to go elsewhere, feel free. But if you'd like to stay and have some kind of discussion, questions, answers, or just comments, I'm happy to stay and have a little bit of talk with you.
I'm wondering what part in all this, you didn't mention the word conscience at all. And I'm wondering, where does that stand with you and then the things you were saying?
Right, so conscience, like an inner voice. It's a part of us, I mean, if you think in these terms, conscience, well, in Platonic terms, this picture comes from Plato. It's something like these two things working together. Conscience is something like second nature. So when we say something's natural for human beings, what we mean is I didn't have to think or try hard to make it happen. So when I say something's come as second nature, what I mean is I've trained enough and formed enough of a habit here so that I don't have to work hard. It just comes natural to me to take vitals on a patient if I'm a nurse, or to swing the bat this way if I'm a ball player. Conscience is something like that. So we hope to develop virtuous forms of emotional response. So anger, for instance, is about injustice. If I see a baby being trampled to death, the proper response emotionally is outrage and pity. Pity for the child and outrage about what's happening. Anger is supposed to motivate me to action and be a sort of visceral reminder that backs the play of the intellect. This is wrong, we need to restore God's justice. But when disordered, if not well-formed, anger is just about control. I get angry because people aren't doing things the way I want them to do them. Right? And so anger is a holy emotion when it is well conformed to God's will and it has a proper understanding of what justice looks like and how people should be treated. But so quickly becomes wrath in this negative sense of just flying off the handle because things aren't just so according to my picture of the world. And conscience, I think, in this tradition of virtue and vice is closely tied to this picture of how do you properly form, to the deep emotional level, your reaction to the world so that when you start to think about, should I do this? Immediately you have this response, not only intellectually, but also sort of viscerally, I think we shouldn't go there. Something's wrong here, right? But the more that we do it, the more we warp ourselves so that we continue to stifle that voice. I don't know if it ever goes away. Consequence is going to make that, I think, stay there. We're always going to see self-destruction, even if we don't realize it. So at some even rudimentary level, there's going to be conscience. But it's more or less helpful depending on how well it's formed. Is this getting at what you're interested in?
But wouldn't that conscience that he's talking about, wouldn't that be formed, a well-formed conscience from the parents and environment from birth on? Wouldn't that be where that conscience comes from?
Yeah, it's lifelong, and those are the first and the most important influences. Yes.
But of course, as we get, 15, 17, we're in there, we need to keep developing that well-formed conscience. We can't let it, the secular world can pull it their way very easily when you're not, screw tape letters, when you're not expecting it, he can go in there and pull you the other way.
Yeah. Right. When I'm 5, because mom and dad says so, isn't good enough. But when I'm 15, I need more for the conscience to properly function. So if you've ever heard of anything like the Order of Angels, we hear a lot of angel stories throughout the Bible, and they're very strange creatures. They're described differently depending on the books that we're looking at. But at one point, there are these creatures, the seraphim, literally the fiery ones. And the idea is, they're called the fiery ones. They have all these wings, and because they look that way, as being so close to God's love. They're sort of on fire with being and joy and love, being so close to the fountain of all goodness and life. And so the seraphim, the fiery ones, are sort of a picture for us from Scripture and tradition that helps us to see what it's like to be in God's love, right? To be on fire. And we have this language of fire when we talk about the Holy Spirit. The closer we get to God and the reality He's given us, and our neighbors are part of this creation He's given us, the more we enter into His life, the more we are part of this fire and we're filled with it. And when we sin and we don't see our friends, or we don't read the Bible, or if we do read the Bible, we don't try to apply it to ourselves. We tend toward sort of nothingness. It becomes colder. There's less that's there.
Or say that what you're speaking of, and what's the principle with the living vine?
The living vine. So Jesus says, I'm the vine, you're the branches.
And do not let the foxes...
Yeah.
I would have to go back and read it carefully and, to myself. But as far as like just being a part of the living vine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think.
Which is Jesus. Wait, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Can you repeat what you said in the beginning?
Sure. So Jesus says, "Abide in me," right? And only in this way will you have life. I'm the vine, you're the branches. And we get this life because we have been grafted on to Him, who is the life-giving vine. The way this might cash out in terms of Plato's Republic in this picture is, I mentioned before, philosophy is not about navel-gazing, about looking inward. Looking inward is part of the story, but it's ultimately about looking upward and outward. So this person is sort of looking up. And the whole point of the lecture is to hear God, right? So the end of the story is, how do we stop ordering ourselves? How do we stop, properly order ourselves so that we can hear God? And in the Republic, when he talks about the philosophic nature, the nature that loves truth, and Jesus who says He's the way, the truth, and the life. So in a sense, the philosophers called to love Jesus, right? When Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love God with your whole heart, mind, body, and soul. We're called to engage Him in all of our fullness, including with our minds, philosophically. In the Republic, 400 years before Jesus in the Gospels, Socrates says, The goal of the philosophic nature is to seek out and keep company with and befriend the divine and the orderly. And insofar as is possible for a human being, to become like the divine. And so Socrates talks about the philosophic life as a life of friendship with God and of becoming as much like God as we can because of our friendship. So the whole point of this is, when I have myself ordered well, what's the test? The test is how well I can be attuned to what's out there that's giving me this creation in the first place. And in that way, my intellect can sort of graft myself onto this vine.
So it's so important as a student that I am able to graft myself onto a vine in which I can go out into the community and use the knowledge that I have in a productive way, Christ-like, in the community.
Yes, yes. What you just said, yes to that, yes. And thank you for this exchange here. Yeah. Other questions? Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to add something to that that's totally not in it at all. But when it comes to, we'll use it loosely, so sin of what, like you were saying about, I should not have, pushed that person away so quickly. When it comes to that, or any kind of a sin, the best thing to do then is go to confession and just say it to the priest and just say, I don't know if it was a sin or not, but I want to say it just in case it is. And through life, when you do that, you grow, and God opens up things to let you see the truth behind it.
Yeah, knowing when to admit we're wrong, repentance,
Right.
destroy that growth. Yeah. Thank you. Dave, go ahead.
Dr. Pearson, thank you, first of all. Very helpful in terms of increasing our awareness of squirrel and getting distracted from the now, and the importance of mentors and guides to help. Other ways of cultivating awareness that you find most helpful in terms of, just cultivating the ability to be present. Yeah.
Well, you could answer that question very well. I know that. But some tips I suppose I could add here. Grace builds on nature, this old saying. So the idea I think here is, what are you doing in your life? What's your typical day look like? What are your obligations and responsibilities? And so if you can identify that, you then start to build on that and figure out how to develop attention to the now practices that flow out of that. So for instance, for me, writing means I'm at the computer a lot. So practices I have to develop come from figuring out whether, when I write, I'm actually tuning in properly to what I should be doing, or if I'm going off on a trail. Or if I'm getting distracted and I just need a break from my writing and I start looking at YouTube. But I start to realize, because my work means I'm in front of a computer a lot, my practices for paying attention to what's happening now so that I can hear voices are going to focus around that in my life. A firefighter's going to have a different problem, right? I started noticing this actually when I had fewer children at this point. I think we all had 2. Samuel was maybe 3 years old. And I teach a lot of online classes. Like I said, I'm on the computer a lot. And he walked in the room, and he started pushing on a laptop. He's saying, "I'm being daddy." And I already knew, because I felt the tension. I couldn't rest. I'm always thinking, maybe a student just emailed me, right? That I'm always thinking, 10 minutes I'm with my kids, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, but should I check my email, right? I couldn't properly Sabbath keep. I didn't know when to work and when to rest and how to have a rhythm in my life. Not alone on Sunday, but the whole week. And so when I started seeing that, it took my kid sort of imitating daddy for me to see what's going on there. And so I started realizing I need to have these rules in place about when I'm going to check email, make the expectations clear. So it's not just so the students know when I'm going to show up, but for my own sanity. Because even though I might not answer email at 2 a.m., I'm thinking about it. But if I can start to set these rhythms in place for myself, I stop thinking about it and I can actually sleep. Yeah.
So God went through your little 3-year-old and talked to you.
Yes, yes. I think it helped my students as well. You know, they're used to the, wait, it's 3 in the morning, why didn't he get back to me? I emailed him at 2 in the morning, right? And so I wake up at 8 a.m. and I got like 10 emails when I didn't establish the expectations, right, before I had done all this stuff. And so there's a lot of anxiety on their part because they're not used to this, anxiety on my part because I know they're emailing me all through the night. And I start to make it clear, hey, just chill. 9 a.m. every day I check stuff. I'll get to you at 9 a.m. And so they might email me at 2 a.m., but they don't email it at 2:15 because they know it's going to be later. This immediacy of recognition, right? It's not just the communication, but it's also, oh, now they know I'm up at 2 a.m. checking my email. Now I set a precedent. So the whole thing going back and forth, right? Yeah, I think you can identify with this as being an online instructor too, but find out where you are and then go from there. What kinds of things help that pattern of life given what you're being called to at that moment?
For balance.
And the very least for balance, yeah.
I was just thinking that the distractions are multiplied by the fact that we're also distracted by the things we've already done. That we're still kind of ruminating on the things that we hope to do, might do, or worried about doing in the future. And so, like, at least for me, I feel like distraction isn't just this moment and all it has, but it's thinking too much about past and future instead of just trying to think about what is happening right here, right now.
Yeah.
People that I'm here with God's presence in this particular moment.
Yeah. Oh, I know what you mean. And I think one of the reasons this is a temptation is because there's a good form of it. So not many people, some people spend a lot of time crafting an email. I'm one. Not everyone does. People just, they just shoot it off. And after I spend that time, I'll look at it again. Did I write it the right way? And I'll start to wonder, did what I want to communicate get across? Or did I say something that was ambiguous or misleading? Sometimes it can help me with future communication, but other times it is this thing that becomes obsessive, and I am wasting time rereading my email for the 5th day in a row. Yeah.
I proofread my text messages, so I totally become
Yeah. All right. Well, again, I want to thank all of you for coming. Please feel free to come to our other events, sf.edu. You can go there and just Google Philosophy Theology Lecture Series, or go straight to philosophy.sf.edu. And all of our lectures are listed there. Our next lecture is going to be in September, 7 p.m. in the building with the planetarium dome. Father Mark Gertner is going to be a guest lecturer for us, 7 p.m. that evening. So thanks again.